Alright, so it says that
Before we start.
it's already starting.
Okay. I was going to say, which is better? Ultra low DDR Mog or regular talking DDR Mog?
Regular talking would probably
Before
be...
we start.
It's already starting.
Okay.
Shit, I was going to mute. I thought I had that muted already. Okay. So, hello, good evening, and welcome to Francis Gary Powers Mayday Grand Slam. This is a production of Republic News with your hostess, Liviana, and I am your hostess, Liviana. With me this evening, I have, again, DDR Mog, or DDR Mog. I'm not really sure how you pronounce that. Who was here on the, what was this, the end of June, I guess it was. We did a stream back around then that was called A Magic Bullet Ride, and on that occasion we did discuss a bit about liberalism and progressivism and various kinds of socialism, mostly talked about Marxism and heterodox or heretical Marxism. Yes, it was the 23rd of June, A Magic Bullet Ride. So those of you who want to check that out later, there is a link to that stream in the video description, I believe. I think I put one there. So, yeah, I did. So, if you want to go check that out later to see see whatever the earlier discussion, that link is there for you to be able to go do that. And so DDR, would you like to introduce yourself yet again for those who may not have seen you here before? Hello?
Don't worry, I'm still here. I'm just making sure everything's ready.
Okay.
Hi there. It's pronounced DDR Mog, to be precise.
Okay.
Yeah, and the term Mog is a very old English term to refer to a cat.
Mm-hmm.
I used to call all my cats Moggy or Mog.
I see.
So that's where it comes from. That's where I use the name from. Although on most leftist circles and most Discord circles, I'm known as Hauntology at the moment.
As Hauntology?
Mm-hmm.
Hontollogy?
Yes, it's very similar to in spelling to, and deliberately similar to spelling into ontology.
Right. Because
hauntology is a subfield of ontology.
Okay. All right then. So, you're talking about ontology on leftist servers?
No, that's my name on Discord, as in that's my full Discord name at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
As in, if someone knows me from a different server, that's probably what they're going to know me as at the moment.
Okay.
If you try to ping me, you'll see the name Ontology come up, DDR Mog. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, we have other names for you too in some of these servers, but I don't know that I'm in any other leftist servers with you. Just this one here. So, and I mean, this one isn't strictly a leftist server, but it's the server for my YouTube channel where I do discuss a lot about progressivism and left libertarianism, cooperative commonwealth, eco-socialism, and so forth. All right then. So last, let's see, how did we do this? Last time on Republic News, we were talking about, let's see, I don't know exactly where we did end, because the stream was interrupted because my Ethernet router battery overheated and disconnected me from the internet. I had to restart it in order to get back on, and by that time, it had been 15 or 20 minutes, and so we just didn't come back, and you wanted to go ahead and go to bed anyway. So I'm not really sure where the stream ended at that point in time, but we did have some talk about, I think you were talking about where you differed from what would be called orthodox Marxism. So you want to kind of summarize that again?
Well, let's see, how would I say it? When I was talking on that stream, I believe I was referring to the national question amongst Marxists.
Mm-hmm. About whether or not there would be nation states.
Not necessarily nations, but whether or not even the concept of nations exists or not.
Because
the majority.
I know that the ideal of classical Marxism or orthodox Marxism is for a classless and stateless society.
Yeah. Although I'm not necessarily arguing about nations in that from that frame of reference. You see, according to Marx, nations are essentially a liberal and a bourgeois construct in order to justify the state, essentially. That's the idea, or justify modern liberal states. I would disagree with Marx on that, at least on the existence of nations, because he believes it's otherwise complete fiction, and that nations don't exist in a real form beyond the fiction that's used in order to subdue people to the state.
I see.
But that's not really, and don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean I'm in favor of organizing people around their nations. In fact, I think that's counterproductive. And on the question of nation states and national liberation, a serious topic of contention amongst Marxists, both orthodox, Marxist-Leninist, Leftcom, Demsoc, I'm wholly against the idea of rallying people based on their nations, unless they are extremely suppressed, as in they are nationally or ethnically suppressed.
So, for example, Scotland.
Yes, historical Scotland, historical Ireland, much of Africa, any nation, or rather any state that's basically actively suppressing that ethnicity, I would not be opposed to assisting it in its nationalistic efforts.
Mm-hmm.
You know, its national liberation, basically.
Right,
but
right.
That's the exception.
So,
I oppose any form of otherwise, especially if it's a liberal democracy. I oppose the idea of supporting politics that revolves around nation or ethnicity.
Right.
Because it's counterproductive.
Okay, so like for example, Sinn Féin had a history of being pretty far left, I would say. I don't think they're quite that far left at the moment, but historically they were. And that goes back to the independence movement for Ireland and the attempt to do the 26 plus 6 equals 1 by, to bring the 6 counties of Northern Ireland back into Ireland and make it a one nation. 26 counties in the Republic of Ireland, 6 counties in the in Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So add those together and you've got one nation. So I know that they had that kind of pretty leftist perspective in the past, and like I said, I don't think they do at the moment. Maybe you could talk about that at some point too. You're undoubtedly more familiar with the situation there now than I am. I haven't kept up with Irish goings-on as much as I used to for about 9 or 10 years it's been since I've paid very close attention. I still pay attention, but nowhere like I did back then.
Right. On the IRA, as you know, and when we're talking about Sinn Féin here in this context, we have to talk about the IRA as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because, technically speaking, Sinn Féin broke away from the IRA.
Right.
And the IRA died after that. The demilitarization and the ending of troubles.
Right.
But in general, socialists were always a major influencing force in the IRA as a revolutionary force. They were always very influential. A lot of people don't know this, but Lenin was present during the Irish Revolution. and made heavy commentary and analysis of it and supported the revolutionaries of Ireland during 1916.
I was not aware
hello
of
there.
that myself. Oh, hi. Hi, Ryan. We are discussing socialism, and in particular, we're talking about Marxism tonight. So I am interviewing DDR Mog, and you want to tell people who you are?
Hi, my name is Ryan. My Twitter handle is Lord Blastington. And also, I run another Twitter account, which is a parody of John Francois Guerpi.
Okay.
Yeah, and so how's your day?
Good, good. I haven't had nearly enough sleep. I'm trying to get my schedule rearranged at the moment so that I'm up in the daytime instead of the middle of the night as I usually am, because I need to have some medical procedure done, and they don't do that at 3 o'clock in the morning. Unfortunately. I have to have an eye surgery. All right, so continue, please, DDR Mog.
Oh, you're alright, yeah. I'm assuming Ryan has been listening to the stream thus far before joining.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Actually, I don't think I've clarified what my position on Marxism is, what specific type of communist I am, did I?
You did say that you were a neo-Marxist, if I remember correctly.
Yes, but technically speaking, that's anybody who supports any Marxist idea beyond the 1960s, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Most people from that time period on would be classified as neo-Marxist. Usually because there's been a few splits, obviously, in Marxism since then. But specifically, my stance would be, as in what type of communist I am, I'm a ultra-leftist, leftcom. Which is why I'm not an orthodox Marxist. For example, taking it back to nation-states.
Okay.
The default stance for a suppressed ethnicity for Marxists, as in for orthodox Marxists, is to back national liberation. Mm-hmm. Like Marx himself backed national liberation. That's where it comes from.
Okay.
In fact, there's a quote here. The Irish and Poles are true internationalists when they are nationalists. I can't remember the exact quote, but basically, his argument is that Marx's argument is that you cannot get these people to back proletarian revolution if you don't get them basically their own ethnic freedom and their own national freedom first, or are unwilling to do that for them. Mm-hmm. And that it's the duty of any suppressed ethnicity to rise up against their oppressors in this context and gain their national freedom. They are the best kind of internationalist when they do these kinds of revolutions.
I see.
As I said, I don't, unless the ethnicity is completely suppressed, I don't support national liberation necessarily, because again, it distracts from the greater issues of class politics, historically speaking, has allowed incredibly revolutionary forces to essentially decay into liberal democracy. Mm-hmm. For example, as I said, socialists were heavily involved in the Irish Revolution of 1916. Some of the commanders were socialists, like De Leon, for instance. James Connolly as well is another example.
Right.
Socialists were always present in the IRA afterwards as well, especially Marxist-Leninists. A lot of people don't know this, but the USSR supplied the IRA with many of its weapons for decades, especially during the Troubles.
Yes, I've seen many a photo of Irish revolutionaries with AKs.
Precisely. And much of the IRA was heavily influenced by that. It still is, actually. Especially the more radical elements of Irish Republicans are still very heavily influenced by Marxism and Leninism. There's also just generic socialism, Republican socialism as well, but that usually ends up siding with Marxism in some direction or some way, often with either the Leninism or Marxism-Leninism, but they just don't say it directly.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't say in front of a TV camera, for example, if it's a TV interview.
Right, right.
But so yeah, that's more of that. But I disagree on the nature of nations themselves with many other Marxists, because I think nations are distinct from states, and I think ethnicities are distinct from states, and I think they are what's known as an emergent construct, as in they are entirely constructed, and they usually are based off a myth.
Right.
But they aren't fake in the same sense that you can just get rid of it and it will disappear.
Mm-hmm.
Like they will continue to pop up and they will continue to appear, even if we achieve a communist state society, they will always continue to exist.
Because culture is probably the defining characteristic of a nation.
Many Marxists believe that nations will disappear along with states in communism, and I disagree with this. Mm-hmm. Because, as I said, many Marxists believe that nations are, again, a construct from liberalism, and they haven't existed before the 19th century. I disagree with this. There's historical evidence that this is not true, that nations are much older than what many Marxists and many people in academia in general agree with. Nationalism studies goes into this quite in detail, actually, and unfortunately many people ignore it despite it being an important area of politics, to much the harm of our movement, because many people, if you attempt to suppress national identity, you're going to get a reactionary reaction without necessarily any progress.
Right.
If you suppress the identity of, say, Irish people or English people or whatever, and some leftists, not all leftists, most of them don't view that as a good idea in general, because it's just not pragmatic, there's nothing to gain out of it. But some people do support that in general. If you do that, you're going to generate a reactionary reaction. And it's not going to work.
Well, yes, and you would think that the English had learned this after all that time of trying to suppress the Irish language, the Welsh language, the Gaelic language, Manx, Cornish, and so forth. I mean, they even try to suppress Broad Scots.
But they almost succeeded, actually, with Scots. But that's because the political situation between Scotland and England was a little bit different. It's a lot harder to suppress someone who's angry at you for conquering them.
Mm-hmm, right.
With Scotland, it was political union.
Right.
But there's also just the nature of how England treated us as well, as in that's why we maintained our identity in Ireland, or why we kept it, because the English continuously bullied us, essentially suppressed us, penalised us for being us, and never really offered any attempt to integrate us into their country. Thought they could basically brutalise us into simply thinking, I'd just be better off being English, quote unquote, and that's that.
Yeah, oh yeah. There's a lot of cultural cringe among Scots. Not all Scots, of course, but there are certainly some who have this sort of inculcated shame at being Scottish, and so they want to...
Shame? What do you mean by shame?
Well, I mean, this is an anthropological term from cultural anthropology, cultural cringe. The thing is like not wanting to speak their own indigenous languages. So, for example, you would have a lot of people in Scotland who would say that Gaelic is only good for growing potatoes, really. And it's obviously a very rich language, and has all this culture associated with it. And as you know, there is an old Irish proverb that says, "A land without a tongue is a land without a soul." A cultural anthropologist and a linguist will generally tell you that language is the vehicle of culture. I'm going to say language is the primary vehicle of culture, because there are other aspects of culture which carry the worldview with them. It's much, much, much easier to get that worldview if you understand the language, right? Which is why people like myself do study the language, Gaelic and Old Irish and so forth, because we want to understand the worldview in its entirety and not simply extricate certain elements that we want. Like there would be people, I say, among Celtic polytheists, there are those who are called Celtic Reconstructionists, and they generally do try a bit of language studies, but they don't really want to adopt the entire culture. They just want the religious elements of the pre-Christian Celtic culture, whichever particular culture they happen to be have some affinity with, whereas a Celtic revivalist would say, no, you have to take the entire culture, because a sacred tradition is culturally specific. It can't be separated from the culture of origin, and vice versa, which is why these Celtic revivalists would also say Christianity is not Celtic. There's no such thing as Celtic Christianity, for example. Some of these people would say that Christianity's worldview is inconsistent with the underlying Celtic worldview. And there are a number of examples of why they say this. I would fall more in that camp.
I don't know. Personally, as someone who's actually been in school, learning Irish and being exposed to Irish so much while I was in school, as well as knowing some of the history of the Irish language, I would necessarily disagree with that. There is heavy Christian referencing in the Irish language, as Christianity has been with the Irish language for over 1,000 years.
Oh, I'm not going to deny that there is certainly a very strong Christian influence on Irish society today, and has been for some time, right?
It's not just some time, 1,000 years.
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, for some years. Time, I mean, like, not like yesterday or anything, but yes, over a millennium, it has influenced Celtic culture, or Irish culture. We have the same thing in the United States. There is this kind of underlying assumption of Christian ideals and myths and so forth. They permeate our literature, our poetry, our music, our art. It's there. But the idea that Celtic revivalists have is that the worldview of Christianity is inconsistent with the native or indigenous pre-Christian Celtic cultural worldview, which, among other things, involves triplism, whereas Christianity has a dualism. The Christian metaphysics and ethics are both dualistic, whereas when you talk about really any Celtic cultural worldview, you're going to be talking about a triplistic metaphysic. For example, you have the three cauldrons, the cauldron of sea, the cauldron of land, the cauldron of sky, and then you have those also, to put it in more occult terms, it would be like the same thing as macrocosm and microcosm. So you would have the three cauldrons also reflected in the individual person. You have this idea of corp, anum, and spirit, which are body, soul, and spirit. And the idea of sea, land, and sky. So you have sea would correspond to the past and the ancestors and the soul. Land would correspond to the present and the spirits of nature and the body, and spirit would correspond to, sky would correspond to the spirit and the gods and goddesses and the future. This kind of triplistic perspective is very prominent throughout all the Celtic cultures. You have also, for example, the Triads of Ireland and the Welsh Triads, these proverbial wisdom sayings. You have people like Peter Beresford Ellis saying that for the Celtic people, 3 is the number of all things. And I think that's rather exaggerated, because if you read the Rees brothers talking about the various numbers that are important in Irish and Welsh culture, pre-Christian Celtic culture, they talk about 3, they talk about 5. You know, you have your Cooked in Ireland, the 5 provinces, for example. They talk about 9. They talk about several other numbers. There are, for example, in some of the texts, there are 33 islands in the Western Sea that are part of the other world. You know, so when you have the story of the voyage of Bran, or the voyage of Saint Brendan, was it? Yeah, I think it was Saint Brendan. Both of them go out into the Western Sea, which is, of course, the Atlantic Ocean, and they encounter various otherworldly kinds of islands, and the total number given in at least one of those stories, and I don't remember whether it's the story of Bran or the story of Brendan, but one of those has a total number of 33 islands.
Hello.
Which also is very interesting in connection with the Vedic gods of India. To go back to, there's a passage somewhere, I think it's in the Rig Veda, which says there are 11 gods in the sky, or in heaven. There are 11 gods on earth, and there are 11 gods in, and I don't remember whether it says the sea or the ocean or the underworld or whatever, or hell. I think it may say hell. But anyway, so that would, 11, 11, 11, that's a total of 33. That was quite an interesting discovery, I learned as well. But certainly there are more numbers of importance than simply 3. But it is a very, very important number in Celtic thought. I think you would agree. So where you have, on the other hand, you have Christianity, which assumes that good and evil are both metaphysical essences, and that there is this ethical conflict between good and evil, whereas you would have, say, in Greek, pre-Christian Greek society, you would have good and bad. You would have nobility and churlishness, for lack of a better word, knavery. In Celtic and Germanic cultures, you have this kind of concept of order and chaos. Not so much good and evil. Evil, that thing about good and evil actually came into Christianity from Judaism, which got it from the Persian Zoroastrians during the time they were in captivity in Babylon for 70 years. So there's that. And dualism is a very metaphysically unsatisfying and ethically depressing perspective. You have this idea that the body is corrupt or evil, or has been has been corrupted in some way, and likewise the nature in general, the world, the earth, the planet, everything there is natural. Everything that is natural is somehow corrupted by the fall, or is inherently evil. That would be the perspective of the Zoroastrians, if they had the same kind of dualism, the flesh and spirit dualism that you find in the New Testament. I'm trying to see what's going on here. So there's that issue as well, and a number of other issues. Certainly the dualism, especially in the form it takes in Christianity, and Islam, and not so much in Judaism anymore, but it used to, is this kind of monopolistic dualism, that theirs is the one true and only way, and we're going to convert you. And we're going to convert you by force if necessary, because they feel threatened, because of the idea that someone might be apparently virtuous, good, noble, honest, and blah blah blah, and still not believe in their God, or that they feel this idea that they need to convert people out of compassion so that they don't wind up in eternal hell and stuff like that. You don't get that kind of thing much with culturally specific sacred traditions, because unless you're part of the culture, I'm going to go around and conquer you and force my religion on you. I talk about missionary activity and evangelism as religious imperialism, because that's what it really is. You don't get that so much with, when the Celts conquered people in the past, when they marched into Rome and stuff like that, long before Julius Caesar, they just went in and, took over for a little bit, and they said, okay, now you got to pay us tribute, and they left, right? So they weren't interested in imposing their religion or their language or anything else on the Romans. They just wanted some silver from them, right? Silver and gold. And so they would create these kind of client tribes, basically. You get with Christianity, you have this same kind of inherited Greco-Roman, Babylonian, Persian, Assyrian kind of idea of taking over. And you can find this represented in the myth of creation in Genesis. Now, there are, of course, two different myths, but one of them talks about be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. Well, the word that's translated there as subdue is, in Hebrew, it literally means trample underfoot. So this idea of disdain for the earth, that it is something to be subjected, and that kind of translates over into attitudes toward other people, other religions, other cultures, other languages, and so forth. This is one of the reasons why Latin spread throughout Europe, or most of Europe at one point in time. It was the language, the lingua franca, so to speak. You have the same thing going on with the English, with the British Empire. When they conquered, they tried to impose the English language on the people that they conquered. They tried to impose Christianity on the people that they conquered. They tried to impose their own particular ideas about morality and ethics. So especially in the Victorian era, you had this kind of almost puritanical perspective on anything to do with sex, sexuality, and certain words that were viewed as taboo, some of which were sexual in nature, but others were the origin of taboo words in English goes back to the Norman invasion, 1066. From that point until 200 years later, no king of England spoke English. They spoke Norman French. Norman French was the language of the court. It was the noble language. And so the vulgar tongue, and vulgar is a Latin word that means nothing more and nothing less than common. The common tongue of the common people was looked down upon. You couldn't use that language in court. If you went to visit the king or any of your feudal barons or whatever, you had to speak to them in Norman French, and it was perfectly acceptable to say all manner of extremely explicit things as long as they were in Norman French, but you couldn't say, for example, cunt or boggles or fuck. If you said it in Norman French, it was perfectly all right. And some of the expletives used in the Romance language are very, very graphic. I mean, take for example the Spanish expletive carajo, which means penis of a donkey, right? And it's translated as damn, right?
Liv?
Uh-huh.
I don't want to interrupt you there, but we have gotten really off topic.
Yeah, I know. I am wandering off.
We've spent about
explain.
half an hour on this tangent now.
Let me bring. I can't bring you back in, DDR.
We also need to bring this guy back in.
Yeah, I did. It took a second for it to work. I don't know why, but anyway. So there you have that. And
okay, here we go.
So now we have Anime Moon in here as well. So go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
I'm Alex Tinsley, also known as Anime Moon. I write for Honey Badger Brigade, and I guess at this point I'm kind of a regular on this show.
Yes, you are. I'm going to turn your volume down just a little bit because I have earbuds in now, and I had all of you guys turned up quite a bit whenever I was using my external speakers. But I can't take the explosive voice in my ear. So there we go. All right. So we are actually talking about socialism, various forms of socialism, and in particular we have been talking about Marxism and heterodox Marxism and neo-Marxism, which is how we got off on the thing about national nations and cultures and sacred traditions and so forth.
Yeah, your tangent though was actually quite useful for my point to bring it up, because a huge number of those details, academically speaking, there's no field to discuss them or their importance.
Well, there is the field of Celtic studies. I mean, there are Celticists.
It wasn't in the 19th century.
Right,
it wasn't
right.
in the 19th century, is what I'm saying. Many Marxists refused to adopt that information because they, I don't know, it's ideological inertia, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not just true of Marxism, it's also true of much of academia. Academia has kind of deliberately ignored the field of nationalism because much of academia basically views it as essentially being a temporary phase of society.
Mm-hmm.
Not a long-term part of phase. Like, it's only showed up in the 19th century, it's going to vanish within the next few centuries. That's what they think.
I'm going to
say... So they've neglected to study it, or most of them have.
I'm going to say this as someone who was trained to be an academic and who did have a very brief